back there? Can you hear me? Okay, we're live now. Welcome everybody that's here in person and everybody that's watching online. Glad to be back in person. Forgot how stiff and stodgy just the online thing can be, and especially when Braden was behind my right shoulder in the kitchen last week. Now he's back where he belongs, where I can see him back there. He and Garrett running the technology. Garrett and where did Caden go? Well, there he is. Hey, Caden, Garrett, and Caden have been crawling around up in the roof, and we hope that our projector holds tonight. As I was saying, there's only 3 things that can go wrong with it, and 2 of them have now been replaced, so we'll see. It'll probably be the 3rd one, or the 4th one. There'll be something else before we're over. You really got off the hook last week. You didn't have your quiz. And as Larry said over here, it was the first quiz where he got all the answers right ever in all of these years. Well, you've got your quiz tonight, so we'll get right to it and get started. We have so much ground to cover, even after all the ground that we covered on Sunday morning, really by way of introduction. The tack that I took on Sunday morning was about one of 100 different ways you could tackle the story of Noah and the flood. We'll get into a lot of the technical tonight, and then the practical and the theological implications of this story as well. So to your questions tonight, in a clarification from last week, the distinction was made between traditional or pastoral commentaries of Genesis and what kind of commentaries? Technical commentaries, that's exactly right. Number 2, in Genesis, humanity that's supposed to be created. I apologize. I've been working on this all day and my eyeballs went a little, or it's created is fine. We're created. That's how we would say it in North Georgia. We created with great dignity, whereas the Mesopotamian gods created humans as blank or as puppets. Slaves. Well, someone was really paying attention over here. I like that. Slaves. The Satan is mentioned in only 4 places in the Old Testament. Can you name any of those? Job, and throughout the entire book of Job, that's a very good answer there. No, Old Testament only. We're going to deal with Old Testament only. No? Chronicles. Somebody said Corinthians. I'll take that as Chronicles. Psalm 109 and Zechariah 3. Those are the only 4 places that you have Satan mentioned specifically by the Satan in the Old Testament. 4, what are the 4 major interpretations of the fall that we covered last week? This will be a test if you watched online. They all start with an A. Augustinian. Allegorical. Aquinas. Oh, you're doing great. One more. Think DNA. Ancestral is the 4th one. Ancestral is the 4th one. Number 5, the sacking of what city in 410 AD profoundly influenced Augustine's view that should be viewed, good Lord, look at the typos, of human nature. Rome. Rome was sacked by German barbarians in 410 AD. John Calvin, the Protestant reformer, had a view of human salvation that can be summarized with what acronym? TULIP. The TULIP. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Number 7, Aquinas viewed the fall as more of a blank or a sickness rather than the view of total depravity. Wound. This was asked specifically by Miss Pam right over here, and that's why I included that as a question. Saw that in the comments. That's okay. It's okay. Number 8, Eastern Orthodox theology differs from Roman Catholic and traditional Protestant theology because of what main reading? It should be reason. What main reason? It's not total depravity. See, I even tried to imitate you there. That was good. But there's a little more specific answer. You're on the trail. You're still on the trail. No? The Eastern Orthodox Church rejects Augustine's theology. So all of it. You don't get just the total depravity, you get the whole thing. And we'll talk, no tulips, right, no tulips. Number 9, when the ages of the patriarchs from Adam to Moses are added up, they come to 12,600 years, a blank Jewish number. Yes, ma'am. It is an apocalyptic Jewish number. It's the same number used in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the war between the sons of light and darkness. It's the same number used in the prophet Daniel, and it's the same number used in the book of Revelation, 1260, or a form of that. And then number 10, what king discovered a Torah scroll in the Jewish temple in 621 BC? Exactly 12,600 days before the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. Josiah discovered that scroll. It is like a little Mayan countdown clock inside that little passage in Genesis. It's fantastic. Okay, a couple of questions I received, and I'm glad that people still had questions after what I shared last week in the clarification and the introduction time. I surely do not want to squash any conversations. That's not quite the first question, Garrett, so hang on just a second if we can go dark on that one. Question number 1, this is kind of funny. Are you sure we're going to get through the entire book of Genesis in the time that we have left? Yes. Genesis 1 through 11 is the primordial, mythic, big picture section of Genesis. Genesis 12 through 50, the remaining moves on to the personal. Genesis 12 through 50 focuses on 4 individuals. After tonight, we have 4 sessions, and we will look at these 4 individuals. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. That's exactly right. So we will cover, it's like, how did Keith Marika told me when in his career, and he worked in Wall Street and all this stuff. He said his career was like getting a plane off the. I think I might be out of battery here. Let's see. No, I'm good. All right. We got a little interference tonight. I got it. Try again. There. Still. Hello. It might have been Judy's phone. Her phone was ringing, seriously, as this was cutting out. That can be a thing, so be aware of your cell phones. Keith talked about his career, about getting his career off the ground. It was like a 747 running down the runway, that it took all the energy to get it off the ground. And once it got off the ground, it took a lot less energy to keep it up there. I'm going to have to move to a microphone. Can you bring me that other microphone? Check. 1, 2. All right. You'll have to put up with me holding this microphone tonight in full televangelist mode. So I apologize for that. So we'll get through Genesis 1 through 11. A whole lot of energy is taken there, and then we'll move much quicker after tonight. Question 2. You said the early Babylonian stories are much older than the stories in Genesis. How do we know this? Now we can go with that slide, Garrett. There are 2 main reasons that we know this. Number 1 are the archaeological findings related to the Sumerian and Akkadian languages. They are much, much older than the Hebrew language. So writing in Babylon, in Mesopotamia, is one of the oldest centers for writing in the world. Maybe Egypt can compete, maybe parts of China, but certainly in the East, as we call it, Babylon was much more advanced. Mathematics, science, everything. It was just the center of Middle Eastern and Asian civilization. So we know that. And then we know the development of the Hebrew language. And knowing that, we know that
The Hebrew language is 1,000 years behind the Akkadians and the Sumerians before it could be written. And they borrow a lot from that. So I've got a parallel for you. How long have we been speaking English? Since I was born. That's exactly right. Only English, recognizable English that you would understand. Only about 500 years. And that would be pushing it. Because if you were to read a 1611 King James Bible, you would find it very difficult to read in many places because the pronunciations and the spellings are different than we have today. So this is the parallel. Around 500 AD, the Anglo-Saxons arrive in what is today Britain. And they bring with them their language, which is rooted in German. It's a German dialect. English begins to develop over 500 years. This gets interrupted after the Battle of Hastings. Tell me, Doug Balfour, what happened at the Battle of Hastings? See, he's so knowledgeable. If you want to know anything about anybody, any battle for the last 1,000 years, ask Doug Balfour. He knows it. He's probably been to the battlefield. So the Normans invade England in 1066. That brings all the French language into that German dialect that was already there, and English as we know it now begins to really take shape. It's not stabilized until the 1500s, so think Shakespeare. By the time you get to Shakespeare, English as we know it is in place. It is a 1,000-year process for the spoken English we speak today to get established. And the Hebrew language followed almost an exact pattern, taking just about the same time. So that's how we know about these ages. Question 3 that I got this week. Did the Jewish people believe in the devil? Do they believe in the devil now? What a great question that is. I wish we had an hour to talk about this. I do not have an hour. I'll give you 3 minutes. The Jewish people early on believed in Satan as a verb, and only in time did it become a noun and a name. What do I mean by that? Satan was the Satan, the tempter, anything that tempted, anything that distracted you from doing God's will. And then over time, it became a noun and finally a name. Completely different than what you would find in the Christian development, say, of the devil. That's a whole different thing. So over time, Satan became personified through a lot of Persian influence and primarily out of the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is not in your New Testament or Old Testament. It was written 200 years before Jesus. So the Old Testament was more or less taking its shape, but it was still very influential. And in the book of Enoch, there's a character named Azazel that takes kind of this Persian influence role that would become Satan. If you were to ask, I think, a lot of Jewish folks today, what do you believe about the devil? They would more or less default to the original belief. The devil is a force against goodness, but they don't really believe in a personal Satan the way that it has developed in Christianity. In Christianity, it took on an entirely new belief, an entirely new persona because of Christian theology and that sort of thing, but also because of the Middle Ages and the Black Death and all those other things. There's one reference in the book of Isaiah to Lucifer. It is a terrible, intentional translation where the translators of the King James Bible, where it says light bearer, they chose to name that as a proper name, Lucifer, that only one spot in the Old Testament, but it actually is both in the Greek and the Latin referring to Venus in the morning sky. It's a bad translation, and you will not find it in other English translations that are younger than the King James Version translation of the Bible. Now, this takes me really quickly to the fourth question that I had. Isn't Satan and aren't his demons fallen angels. Well, that's a long-standing theory established by a handful of verses from the Bible and outside the Bible. We have to go again to the book of Enoch, a book in place during the time of Jesus that never met the high water mark of being considered scripture. Fallen angels and demons are all over that book and some other apocryphal books. Some connect fallen angels to Genesis 6. We're going to talk about that tonight. Luke 10, Matthew 25, 1 Corinthians 6, they all talk about fallen angels. And then really interesting, 2 Peter chapter 2 and Jude verse number 6 refer to fallen angels, and they are both quoting the book of Enoch. And those two books barely got in the New Testament canon because they were quoting a source outside of the Bible. So, and then you have the book of Revelation, and it's all over the place. And probably our concepts about fallen angels and demons today rely much more on John Milton and Paradise Lost than anything that we can cohesively put together in the Old or New Testament. Question 5, does there have to be a literal Adam and Eve because of what the Bible says? My answer, this is my answer, no. You don't have to have that answer. You do have to have that answer if you take Augustus or Aquinas' view of the fall. Augustus and Aquinas both require a literal Adam and Eve for their theology to work out. If you take the allegorical approach or if you take the ancestral approach, neither of those requires a literal Adam or Eve. So I default to my dear friend Landon Saunders, who always said, what you start with determines where you end up. So whichever theological horse you mount in Genesis 3 will determine which destination that you end up at. Now, for my part, I'm simply not an Augustinian. I haven't been for some years. That used to be my home address, but I don't live there anymore because I disagree with his premises. I disagree with his view of the atonement. I disagree with his view of human depravity. I don't think it holds up over time. And because I disagree with him at the beginning, I disagree with him at the end. Does that make sense? And so if push comes to shove, what of those four major views I fall pretty squarely in the allegorical camp. That this is a story to be told to teach us a whole lot. But it does not require literal or historical roots. I think that sums it up well enough. And there's so many, and there are other questions that were related to these, but those are the major ones that I had. But we've got to get going. It's already 10 minutes to 7. We're going to talk about the flood. And we're going to do it old school style, alliterated, traditional form. The cause of the flood, compare and contrast the flood, and then the consequences of the flood. So here we go. There are a couple reasons given as to the cause of the flood. One is a matter of a fact reason, and the other is much more complex. To the easy one first, you have it there on your resource, Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7, and Genesis 6, verses 11 through 12. And the reason, the cause for the flood is human wickedness, particularly violence. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry he had ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. And the Lord said, I will wipe this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Now God saw that the earth had become corrupt and was filled with violence. God observed all this corruption in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. Verse number 5, the word wickedness. The Hebrew word is ra. Very simple. It just means bad. That's about as easy as bad, bad, bad. Wickedness is a very good translation. At the end of verse 5, totally evil is said, and it's the same word used again, ra. Verse 11, we are introduced to the word corrupt. Shakath is the Hebrew word, something that is spoiled, something that is ruined. It's a stronger word than bad, and it's the same word used twice in verse 12. So you have all this generic badness until we get to that phrase, filled with violence. And the Hebrew word there, see if this sounds familiar to you, is the word Hamas. It has a ring to it in the Arabic, does it not? The word in Arabic for Hamas is zeal, fire. In Hebrew, it means brutality, savagery, personal injury. And so what we find here is that humanity, in the interpretation of the Genesis writers, has devolved into just being brute animals with one another. So the divine reasoning for the flood, the Hebrew interpretation of the cause of the flood, is human failure. It grieves God that it's all turned out this way. God wishes to wipe the slate clean, earth being that slate, and just starting over. Jesus would say to his disciples in the Gospel of Matthew, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. And he's referring to this idea of just unleashed violence and badness in the world, which could be a description of human history for all practical purposes. Sheer brutality. And yes?
Doesn't it snag your thinking, the reaction that God has to all of this ugliness? He's admitting that he's made a mistake and he's sorry he has created all of this. Well, all of those feelings are human feelings, not what we've been taught of God's reaction to what is creation.
Sarah Brunson's made a great observation for those of you that may be watching online, that this grieving of God's heart when he looks at the world is a human emotion, not so much what we would think of God as having. But you cannot read the flood story without having this deep sense of tragedy, that God is in regret. God is in mourning. And even after God acts, and we'll get to this, God regrets after he has acted that God has done what God has done. Very human in that sense. And very different than the capricious gods of the Babylonians. The gods of the Babylonians, and Sarah, you've hit right on it. The gods of the Babylonians were fickle and unpredictable. I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead and say that the Babylonians have a flood story too. Do you know the reason that they drowned everybody on the earth? Because the people were being too loud and they couldn't sleep at night. This fickle way of the gods. The Hebrews are being very intentional that God is deeply involved with God's creation and feels. Very good point. That's just very good. Where am I here? All right. No, that's good. No, I'm glad you said that. To the more difficult cause of the flood. Also in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Is that printed there for you as well? Okay. The people began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any that they wanted as their wives. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not put up with humans for such a long time. They are only mortal flesh. In the future, their normal lifespan will be no more than 120 years. In those days, and for some time after, giant Nephilites, your Bible may say Nephilim or Nephilim, lived on the earth. For whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors of ancient times. Let's get right to it. There is no easy, tidy, simple, or agreed upon explanation for these 4 verses. But this much we can deduce, that what is going on here? Everything's falling off tonight. That plenty of battery, all right. This much we can deduce. The union of the sons of God with the daughters of the earth draws the ire of the Almighty. And this is not what God intended. This here is more than human weakness or human violence. This is some kind of cosmic transgression. And first things first, beautiful women are born on planet Earth. Let everyone say amen. All right. That's how it's always been. And ladies, you are beautiful and desirable. That's God's intention, but it appears in these verses that earthly women are so glamorous that they attract the attention of extraterrestrial beings as well. And so we have these sons of God. Who are these guys? We don't know for sure, but we have options. Here are your options. Number 1, these sons of God can validly be translated sons of the gods, as Elohim can be plural and non-specific. So these could be the vanquished gods of Babylonia, so they could be demigods. Now, that's completely foreign to Hebrew anthropology, completely common for Persians, Greeks, and Babylonians. Option 1. Option 2, these are fallen angels. There are about a half dozen Old Testament references to the sons of God that would infer this. In the book of Enoch, that we keep showing up tonight, they're called watchers, guardian angels that were sent down to earth to protect humans, but these guardian angels, instead of protecting humans, fall in love with them. That's from the book of Enoch. Number 3, these are the descendants of Seth, Adam and Eve's, how do I say this, replacement son for Abel, who Adam says, this child is made in my exact image, bearing the imprint of God's image on him. And that who they are having these relationships with are the daughters of Cain. And so you are mixing the good seed with the bad seed. That's one interpretation. And the 4th is that these are simply powerful, dominant human rulers, and the Hebrews are taking a shot at the Babylonian rulers when they say this. By the way, the Assyrians and the Babylonians were the first kings to ever say that they were the rulers of the entire world. You find, now don't get me wrong, there are arrogant rulers throughout human history. But the Babylonians and the Assyrians were pretty unique in the sense that they are the first to say, we rule the world. Everything belongs to us, this cosmic tug of war. And then you get, of course, to the Nephilim, who are the offspring of this union of sons of God and daughters of earth. The word Nephilim means giants, and the root of that word means fallen. So you could have the fact that these are the fallen angels. It could be that they are aboriginal peoples that we don't know anything about. It could be that they are heroes of old fallen in battle. It could be some kind of polemic against Assyria and Babylon in a way that we do not know about and may never know about. And it depends upon which assumption you make in regards to the sons of God. Whoever these sons of gods are determines a lot of who these Nephilites are. Yes, Judy. It is possible that the question is, would this tie into the Greek gods? That is possible, Gary, do you have I lost volume or did you turn me down? Can you bring me back just a touch? Or put it behind me, be great. It could be related to the Greeks and the Persians because of the time in which the Old Testament came together, but it's just unclear. Again, Greek, Persian, Babylonian culture, have you read any of that? Do you know where the Greek gods came from? The Greek gods came from the fact that Cronus is eating his children because he doesn't want any competition. And finally somebody slips him a stone and it upsets his stomach and he vomits up all his children, and Zeus is one of those. And then Zeus goes running around the world mating with all these women and has the Titans and all these stories. It's very common in ancient literature. You don't find it in ancient Hebrew literature except here, some kind of reference. And I wish I had a more exotic answer for you. I wish I could tell you that these are ancient aliens. And there's a whole show, by the way, on the History Channel of ancient aliens that say that these are aliens. Who knows? We just don't know what's going on here. It's mysterious. It's rooted in Mesopotamia. There's a reason that the writers have included it, but that reason may be lost to us. We simply do not know. And we shouldn't speculate too far because it becomes speculation. And you can, write a book and have a coffee house tour of your speculation about the fallen angels of Genesis chapter 6, but there's no way to prove any of it. Questions, real quick. Great question. Mickey's question is in Genesis 6:3 about the 120 years is a dual. It can mean one of two things or both things. That human life expectancy, you're not going to get past 120, which explains to your original question from the first night about these incredibly long genealogies where someone can live 600 years, 500 years. By the way, in Babylonian mythology, it was not uncommon for rulers to live 2,000 years, they said. So you have this tradition. So that's one. Lifespans will be much shorter. But the other one is, and it's unclear, and you've jumped ahead of me just a little, but it's perfect. Some say this is the amount of time it took for Noah to build the ark, 120 years. That's the space of time between the initial warning that the flood was coming and the flood's arrival. Very good question.
Do you think the thought could be there that the Lord, the Son, that all the bad behavior came after 120?
The question is, the question is, the 120 years is kind of like this deadline. I'm going to get it all. You better get it all in these 120 years. It's hard to say. It's very ambiguous right there. And we are dealing with old, I'm not even going to say the word borrowed yet because you're about to see this, old Mesopotamian roots. And we just don't have access to the same world that these Hebrew writers had. Now we think, I'll just look it up on Google. I'll just go down to the library. There's so much that has been found and recovered that informs our interpretations, but how much here that we just don't know. And there's a lot we can say, and it's a good answer to say sometimes, I don't know. That's really, when it comes to this section, I don't know. But let's get to the compare and contrast real quick of the flood stories. First things first, did you know that there are 2 flood stories in the book of Genesis, not one? Just like were you paying attention about creation? The difference here is that in the creation story, the E source is chapter 1 and the J source is essentially chapter 2. What the writers do with the flood story is they ping pong them back and forth. So the E source is Elohim, the general name for God, sourced somewhere from the northern kingdom of Israel about 700 years before Christ. Yahweh, Israel's specific name for God, sourced from the time of King David 1,000 years before Christ. Every time in your Old Testament that you see the word Lord in all caps, the specific name of Yahweh, Jehovah, is being used. Pick up almost any English Bible, even the ones you should have some stuffed in the seats in front of you there. Look at it, and you'll see Lord in capital letters. Yahweh, not generic God, our God, so to speak. So if you'll look there in the chart, you'll see the ping-ponging effect. We begin with the E source, we jump to the J source. Back to the E source, over to the J source. Back and forth it goes for these chapters about the flood. And what's so wonderful and marvelous about this is it becomes the tapestry that I've been talking about. Next slide, if you would. I did this for you today. Look at this. If you were to pick up a Bible and it was highlighted for you, E source versus J source, it would look like this. Okay? So the yellow is the Elohim source. The pink is the Yahweh Jehovah source. And look, and I printed this out just like you had opened up a Bible from Genesis 6, 7, and 8. Do you see it going back and forth? E speaks, J speaks. Some of it is repetition. Some of it is contrast. And test me on this. Go look at your English Bible, and where it says God, capital G, little o, little d, look at it. It's Elohim. Where it says Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, it is Yahweh. Check my math, as they say. Check the notes on that. So you have two flood accounts weaved together where the Hebrew writers are keeping both traditions, which is so common in the Old Testament. They won't throw anything away. They're going to keep it all. We'll keep them all, y'all decide. There really is that element. Next slide, if you would, Garrett. Here are the differences between the E source and the J source. In the E source, the sons of God and the Nephilites are the main cause of the flood. In the J source, it's human corruption and violence. E source, specific instructions are given about the building of the ark. The J source, no such instructions are given. In the E source, the animals gather 2 by 2. In the J source, they gather 2 by 2, but an amendment. 7 clean animals and 7 birds of each species. Why? No, they didn't want to eat them, but that's a good. For sacrifices, do you see what's happened here? The J source is specifically about the Hebrew God. They are throwing back from Moses' law back onto the flood story. Moses ain't going to show up for a long time, 20 generations from now. But the J source is already including it way back here, that you got to have these clean animals for sacrifice, for sacrificial sakes, even though the sacrificial system does not yet exist. You follow that? Yes, no, maybe? All right. E source Noah is central. His specific age is cataloged throughout. In the J source, Yahweh is central, and it is Yahweh that closes the door to the ark, not something that Noah does. In the E source, a raven is sent out, which is an unclean animal. In the J source, the dove is sent out, which is a clean animal. In the E source, the timeline is specific, and the story ends with everyone and everything just going out of the ark and saying, y'all will have a great life. We made it. And then the timeline on the J source is much more general, and the story ends with Noah making a sacrifice directly to Yahweh. In the east source, Elohim makes a covenant with Noah, marking it with the rainbow, and he presides over the post-flood. And in the J source, Yahweh does not return to the narrative until way forward in Genesis chapter 11. Questions, real quick. Had you ever noticed that there are two flood stories? Some of you have. Some of you have. They are weaved together masterfully. And they are, if we could read Hebrew, if you could read Hebrew, you would see it immediately. It's lost in our English translations. Outside of that clue that at least English translators have given us capitalizing the word Lord, which means that the source has changed. There are a couple. The question is, are there some translations that amalgamate this? Not really, but there are a couple of technical Bibles, and I will clarify next week for you that the authors have highlighted, like I did in 3 chapters, the entire Torah, where it moves between the E source and the J source, and even the priestly source. It's pretty helpful. I don't own that particular copy. I wish if I had, this preparation tonight would have been much easier. But it's out there, probably $30. It's a technical book, probably that thick, where they talk about those exact things. So let's proceed now to contrasting Noah's story with the leading Babylonian flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, there are multiple Babylonian, Sumerian, and Assyrian flood stories. I'm just going to stick with Gilgamesh tonight. The Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered in the 1850s in Nineveh by Henry Layard, the Englishman that we talked about last week. It wasn't translated for a couple more decades. It wasn't published into English until 1902. It took a long time to break the code because this was a language no one had ever seen before. And it took a long time to put together the 15,000 fragments that were discovered in the Library of Nineveh. And it was epic, and it still is. And here was a story much older than Noah's story, with a similar theme and multiple points of commonality. Gilgamesh is this ancient king, the ruler of the city of Uruk, or more commonly known as Ur. Abraham comes from the city of Ur, and we'll get to him next week. So there's a parallel right there as well. And from the library at Nineveh, accounts say that he ruled about 2,700 years BC, making the Epic of Gilgamesh the oldest great story ever written down in the history of the world. And it's a flood account. And in this epic story, he has a friend, and his name is Utnapishtim. I've practiced it. I was practicing it in the truck tonight. In fact, I said to Braden, we need to refer to Tim Riles now as Utnapishtim. That's the Babylonian Noah. But here are the similarities first between these two stories. Both stories share a common memory of a great Mesopotamian flood somewhere between 3,000 and 2,500 years BC. Both stories have God or gods warning a righteous man of the disaster to come and instructing him to build a boat. Both stories have the mandate to save animal life 2 by 2. Both stories have a boat with a single window, a single door, and a door closed and or opened by the gods or God. And then both stories have the righteous man bringing his wife and his son and wives. In fact, the Gilgamesh story has him bringing 3 sons and their wives, exactly as Noah brings. And then, of course, there are differences, and I'll share these with you here. Next slide, if you would. All right. Noah is recorded in Genesis 6, about 500 years BC. Utnapishtim, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, is recorded about 2,000 years BC. In Noah, the ark may have taken up to 120 years to build, back to Mickey's question that he asked. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the boat is built in 7 days. In Noah, the cause for the flood is wickedness. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the cause for the flood was people disturbing the sleep of the gods. In Noah, God, Yahweh, remained in total control of the events. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods are at war with one another during the flood, some trying to keep it going, some trying to stop it. In Noah, it rains 40 days and 40 nights. In the Epic, it rains 7 days and nights. In Noah, after 150 days, the ark rested on Mount Ararat, which is modern Turkey. In the Epic, after 12 days, the boat rested on Mount Nisar, which is in Kurdish Iraq. In Noah, Noah sends out a raven and a dove. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he sends out a raven, a swallow, and a dove. In Noah, Noah's post-flood sacrifice is pleasing to God. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, something that the Hebrews would have never tolerated, Utnapishtim's post-flood sacrifice draws the gods like flies. Very interesting turn of phrase right there. And in Noah, Noah is affirmed by God in the end. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim is deified and joins the gods in the end. So don't let anyone say, that Noah story is just like the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's some similarities, but there are major differences. And they are major differences because of the purpose of the why and the how that the Hebrews are telling their story. All right? Quick questions. I would say that there was a flood, a great Mesopotamian flood for which there is evidence. That I would completely affirm. I would not accept it as North American Christians typically accept it. That's probably the best way that I can say that. I would take the Hebrew, the Jewish interpretation of the flood over, which is much older than ours in modern terms. Nothing has ever been found on Ararat or Nasir for that matter, because Christians go up to Mount Ararat looking for the ark, but Babylonians and Iraqis and Iranians go to Nasir looking for the boat of Utnapishtim, just like Christians do, and they haven't found anything of any substance either. There have been stories published, and there is not a single museum or place of authority that has anything. Now, we saw the same phenomenon after the death of Jesus. There were so many pilgrims and churches that said they had a piece of the true cross of Jesus, that St. Jerome said that if you brought all those pieces together, you could, in fact, be able to build the Ark of Noah. So there are always testimonies to the fact, but rarely are they upheld. Now, if they find Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in northern Turkey one day, you'll see me on the news dancing, and I'll change everything I just said.
About every 25 years, they revive the story of the shroud.
Shroud of Turin is another one that comes around, yeah.
And it makes you want to hope that there's some truth to it.
There's nothing wrong with the hope. Right, and I'm actually going to get to that about why the Hebrews tell the story this way. Because it's very obvious that they are borrowing and they are using a story that's not theirs. But they are using it in a way that is very specific, in a way different than the Babylonians used it. I'm going to get to that in just a second as we talk about the consequences of the flood. I'm down to 8 minutes, so I'm talking fast. Real quick, let's talk about the consequences of the flood, and we'll keep rolling along. 1, God promises to never destroy the world again. I said this Sunday, 8 times God makes that affirmation, negatively and positively. This just didn't work. Because I can wipe humanity away, but you're still the same creature. And we're going to end up in the same place. And so the sign of this is that rainbow in the sky. A couple interpretations of that, of course. It's the bridge from heaven to earth in ancient times. But I love this. I love this view of the ancients. A rainbow was seen as the bow of a warrior. And when the rainbow appears, it's God laying down the bow, saying, I am no longer at war with humanity. It's a beautiful picture that's used right there. And we have this royal compact. The first covenant in the Bible is established between Noah and God. 2, the hourglass of history now falls on Shem, one of Noah's sons. He will be the chosen vessel that will carry Jewish history forward. So we had Adam, disaster. Then we had Abel, disaster. Then we had Seth. Then we had all this Nephilim stuff, disaster. And now there is Noah, the only righteous man left in the world, for God's sake. And it is Shem, his son, who might be the oldest or who might be the middle son. Genesis 10:21 isn't very clear. It's Shem who is left to carry on. And it is Shem, the Shemites, the Semites, sound familiar? Who will carry the line forward to Abraham. Now, Abraham won't show up for 9 or 10 generations, but Shem becomes the forebearer of the Jewish people. And then a third consequence, in light of Gilgamesh and the older stories, and we've been talking about this tonight, Noah has taken on this new role, especially in North American Christianity. When Gilgamesh was discovered, critics of religion, particularly critics of the monotheistic religions, said, look, you see there? We told you this was a made-up book all along. And all they did was steal somebody else's stories and change the names to protect the innocent. And you've built all of these religions on this crazy mythical Babylonian story. Now, a lot of Christians were spooked by that. And for the last 100 years have dug in to prove that Noah is historically and literally true. But that's to take the bait. The Jewish community was unfazed by this because they had never taken the story that literal. They had taken the story as a teaching lesson. And I guess if they were speaking in Yiddish, they would say, what is it? Meshaguna, which means ridiculous. It just bounced right off of them. Because they understood that, of course, we stole these stories. And then we used them for our purposes and said, look, our God wins, you stupid schmucks. That's what they were doing with these stories all along. That opens up the interpretive value of these stories beyond just this one narrow view. And it brings it so alive. I have a slide to tell you. This is why they tell the story the way that they do. Number one, it's a polemic. It's told this way to show the superior powers around the nation of Israel that their God, Yahweh, remains supremely in command, even though themselves they are small and insignificant. Look, you may have all that pantheon of gods. You got more gods than we can count. And you've got all the money, and you've got all the military, and you've got everything. Doesn't matter. Our God still controls the cosmos. They tell that story of the flood. I love it. They tell their story of the flood the Hebrew way to spite that story. And then 2, it's told to show those same nations that the world is not the playground of a pantheon of warring gods. It belongs to the one Creator. They're actually saying you are the ones playing make-believe with all of your contrasting gods. And 3, and this was really the gist of what I said Sunday, it's told for the survival of the Jewish people. The people reading this story, I'm not talking about hearing it, reading it on a scroll for the first time, are post-exile survivors. They have come back to Jerusalem. The temple is burned down. They've spent 2 generations in a foreign land. How do we go on? This is one of the first stories that emerges. This is how you go on. When you're down to one family on the face of the earth, you make your pact with God, you keep believing, and you keep the faith. That's what this story ultimately is about. It's a powerful, it's resistance literature in that sense. Don't cave in, survive. In the words of those theologians' journey, don't stop believing. Don't stop believing. That's the main purpose. And then that brings us finally, and we have 2 minutes left, and we are not going to make it, to the theodicy of Noah. I just don't have time. So I'll stop right there and ask what questions you might have, and I'll have to leave this slide up for a second. It's a very good question that Doug has asked for those of you that are online and can't hear it. In fact, I can't even recap it. It's so good. But basically, God did this. God repented. Can I use that word? Is that the word you're looking for? God repented and said, this didn't work. Doesn't this violate the view of God that God should have known that this would be the outcome? Doesn't it violate this sense of God being all-knowing? That is the theodicy piece, actually, that we don't have time for. Will you give me 5 minutes? All right, let's go back to that previous slide real quick. A theodicy is a venture to reconcile the righteous and loving goodness of God with the injustice and evil of the world that is permitted by God. This is a struggle as old as time, particularly in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament and the book of Job. In fact, Job is earlier than Genesis as far as being written down. So if you were to say, what is the first Hebrew theological question that was asked? It's this one. And a summary of it goes something like this, and this may not be as good actually as Doug asked it. If God is all good and all powerful, then God can eliminate all evil. But because there is evil in the world, God is either not all good or not all powerful, or both. If God is not, the Christian God does not exist, therefore God does not exist. That has been the philosophical sticking point for thousands of years. Thousands of years. This is called theodicy. Now, you have a couple of responses, and this is right to Doug's question. You can respond to this question by first saying, well, the problem of evil is just simply unsolvable and it's a mystery. There's not much we can do to answer it, not much we can do about it. A second possibility, and this is this is really philosophical. I wish we had another hour right here. This is the best possible world. Look, God's just working with what he's got. I love that one. All right, smarty pants, can you come up with a better world? Can you come up with something that would work better where God's in charge but human beings have free will? That's a really good wrestling match right there. Third is the theology of protest. This is what I was getting at Sunday with Elie Wiesel. This is very Jewish. It's very Hasidic Jewish. That when you see injustice in the world, and even if it seems to be God is the one committing it, you have to take God to task and wrestle with God. We're going to get to that with Jacob. We're going to get to that with Abraham. It's rooted deep in the Genesis stories. That when you come up against injustice, it's not just human beings that need to be called into account. You got to wrestle with God on why God would allow this to happen. Very Jewish. And then the fourth possible response, and these are general responses, is the inexplicable is for the growth of the soul and the species. This is as old as Augustine, as old as Christian theology. Evil is inexplicable. If we did not have evil and the unanswerable, we would not grow into the souls and the people that God would intend. Because if we did not have resistance, we would have no strength. So those are the philosophical responses. And then the final slide to your question, Doug, I think is really where we're at. To Noah's flood particularly, the reader must ask this question. Does, not is. Okay, I'm sorry about the typo. Does this account convey intent or interpretation? That is, was this an act of God or a way for the writers to make meaning of their experiences? I cannot answer that question for you. That one will be up to you. Questions? That's awesome. The question is, would your schedule allow for you to be here longer? Yes, it would. I am always conscious of people's time. I tell you what we'll do, God willing, if we can do this, is that I'll take some time when this series ends, and we'll reconvene for any questions that are left over. Can I do that? Okay, so just keep track of your questions. Yes, Garrett. Look at my phone. All right, the question that came online, when in history getting old, people. When in history did the serpent in the garden get interpreted as Satan? In Judaism, it would have been Maimonides in the Middle Ages. In Christianity, by the 2nd or 3rd century, mainly because the book of Revelation makes a direct quote to the devil, that serpent. That's said in the book of Revelation. So Christian interpreters make that tie, within 200 years of Jesus. Judaism probably does it earlier, but I know Maimonides writes about it 1100 and affirms the serpent as the Satan, not Satan, the Satan. Y'all get that? He's using it as a verb more than a name. It's not capitalized. No, not good question. Not capitalized. The Satan. the evil, the resistor, the tempter, not with a proper name until much later. The book of Enoch starts to incorporate some of that, but it has more influence on Christianity than it does Judaism. Oh my God, what a question. The question is, when did we get Revelation written down? You just got to jump from Genesis to Revelation, don't you? Just skip everything in the middle. I'm just playing. That's a hard question. I would say, and in our New Testament study, I would say that Revelation is written near the end of the first century because it is a diatribe against the Roman emperor, first and foremost, particularly against Titus and Diocletian and Diocletian's son. There were 3 Roman Caesars of a father and 2 sons. Those 3 Caesars destroyed the city of Jerusalem, created the great diaspora from which the Jews would not recover until 1948. And it was the end of the world. The end of the world for the Jewish nation. And my view, and not just mine, I made it up, but I think it's a scholarly view that others hold that I'm leaning on, is that it was written in response to that persecution and that destruction of Jerusalem when this is post-Nero, post-Paul, at the end of the first century. You put me on the spot with that one, so I can't. I'm not sure all my names and timelines come up just exactly right. COVID brain. Give me just a second. Hold on. I think it's the Trauvian dynasty. Don't quote me on that, but there are 3 in order that begin reigning about 90 A.D. until 100 A.D. And the book of Revelation is against those 3 individuals. All right, next week, February 5th, session 5, calling particularly of Moses. Excuse me, see my COVID brain's kicking in. I'm at the throttle end of all my words. Abraham, I'm sorry, not Moses. Abraham. We'll pick up at Genesis 11, and we will go many chapters next week and talk about the life of Abraham, the first Hebrew, we could say, called to create the Jewish people. And then we'll rapidly move from the Tower of Babel, which is the last primordial story, right into him. All right? So we'll see you next Sunday.